Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Hataru-san and Imamura-san. I look forward to your presentation in a bit. Very happy to do this again. The last time I attended a RIETI event was almost a year ago. So very happy to also share with you some of the developments that have taken place in APEC over the last year. Here's what I want to cover. These are some areas. I want to, recall what people think about when you mention APEC. That's one. Two, the question is, in this time, does APEC matter? So we did a survey in 2021 and in 2020 of what folks think about APEC. We surveyed, we had a response, we had 7,600 respondents, more than slightly over 7,600 respondents, covering all the economies, the 21 economies of APEC. So I will share with you some of the findings, as well as some of the findings specific to Japan. Then I will walk you through the vision, the Aotearoa Plan of Action, the Leaders' Declaration last year, which is important for us as we plan the year ahead, the work that we have under APEC, and then a focus on Thailand's themes and priorities this year. As you know, Thailand is the chair of APEC. I just also I know some of you may be familiar with this, so I ask for your patience as I walk you through these slides. Next slide, please. What comes to mind when we talk about APEC? Very often when we talk to folks about APEC, the focus is on the leaders meeting. They always focus on the leaders meeting. Whereas APEC, we deal with a lot of issues throughout the year, and not just the Leaders Week. Well, Leaders Week is important because that's a culmination of the work that we've done throughout the year. And it also sets the pace for continuity as we go forward to the next year. It provides that link. If you see in this slide, the 21 member economies, we border the Pacific Ocean. And it's very important because if you look at the way we are spread, how we are spread, these are important economies for trade, investment, and we are on major trade routes. So that's important. Next slide, please. And given that you know that we are a significant part of the population, the world population, of global trade, and more importantly, global GDP. So we can make a difference if we work more closely together. Next slide. Here's our mission. Over the years, we have been consistent in our mission. We have tweaked it to adjust to the current situation, but generally what we focus on and what matters to the economic growth of our population. Trade and investment, promotion, of course. Economic and technical cooperation is a very important pillar. Here's where we share expertise, share policies, share best practices so that we all grow together. With the ultimate aim of improving living standards, and increasingly it's about sustainable and secure economic growth. That's going forward. You will hear more and more of us focusing on these areas. Next slide, please. Does APEC matter? So like I said, we did the perception survey in December. We did the fieldwork in December of 2020. This is right when the COVID situation was at its height, and so we asked folks just cold questions. What comes to mind when you talk of economic cooperation in the Asia Pacific? And we were very pleased that this was unaided. It was a cold question, really. And we got the average for APEC was 23% put APEC right at the top, followed by ASEAN and the United Nations, etc. For the Japanese respondents, 22% mentioned APEC. And well, 31% talked about what came to mind was ASEAN. Well, I also have an ASEAN hat, so I was quite happy about it. But very important to note that APEC is important also for the Japanese public. Next slide. When we talk of awareness of APEC compared with other multilateral organizations, so when we put it out there and we talk of which organizations are you more aware of when it comes to multilateral work, and if you look at the tables, the graph at the at the corner, at the right corner, you'll see the APEC average versus the Japanese average. Having said that, it is still a significant portion of the population which have an awareness of what APEC is. Next, please. And when you ask them about APEC, say, okay, now that you know about, you have some idea what APEC is, what do you associate it with? And again, we were very pleased to see that more and more, most of our respondents focused on our free, open, fair trade and international investment, the interconnectedness of the global economy. And we are seeing also for the Japanese, increasingly their respondents had a higher concern about poverty, wealth inequality, and social inclusion. I found that interesting when you look at the APEC average as a whole, how the Japanese respondents had slight variations from the response that we got from the rest of APEC. Next slide. Importance of cooperation in tackling COVID-19. Recall that this was done in December of 2020, so it was still very much on our minds then. And if you look at the results, the cooperation between economies are important. Generally that was the feedback that we have to work together to ensure stable supply of medical equipment and healthcare. That was uppermost, followed by the response time. It's important to respond quickly to the pandemic. And subsequent to this, you will notice that we did, our working groups did work on stepping up our response to this. And I'm very, very heartened by the work done by our customs authorities. They worked to ensure that, we kept the markets open so that at the border goods could flow, by managing the customs procedures and ensuring that aspect for essential goods, medical supplies could flow. So generally you will see a balance, about equal concerns, the Japanese response compared with the rest of APEC. Next. The effectiveness, I think everyone, talks of all these international organizations that you have. How effective are they? Do we make a difference? And again, if we look at the comparison across the different organizations, we'll see that there's generally a higher respect for the work that APEC is doing when you do a comparison across the different organizations. Next, please. So APEC and multilateralism, yes, they matter to our Japanese colleagues. If you look at how they think it's important to cooperate to solve global and regional problems. And really, when you look at how challenging the situation is, you know that no economy can go it alone. It is all about collaboration. But what I found interesting was the fact that it's a high percentage that had this question of trust. So we'll have to work a little bit more in building that trust in multilateralism. Thank you. Next slide, please. I want to now take us to the Putujaya Vision. When we hit 2020, when we were going towards that year, that was a pivotal year for APEC because we were working towards a new vision. And there was a lot of effort and initiative, a lot of thinking and reflecting on where we wanted to see ourselves as an organization going forward. If you recall, the first drive, the first pivot for us was really the Bogor goals and the Osaka action agenda to implement some of the ideas that were put forward at that time. So that was 1993, 1994. And, so the importance and we saw to some extent the completion or the achievement of the Bogor goals. And by 2020, that was our big ambition. So, you don't stop there. So what do you do next? How do you factor in what's going on in the global environment and how do we stay relevant? So that was uppermost when we set to reflect on our next phase of economic integration. And that's where we came up with our vision of an open, dynamic, resilient, peaceful Asia-Pacific community by 2040 for the prosperity of all our people and future generations. So what it really says is how, as a group, we really thought about our future. And the three key drivers for that future that we plan for ourselves was trade and investment that will continue to be our bread and butter. But as we see how things are unfolding and developing across the globe, innovation and digitalization, you cannot have that sort of conversation without taking on board innovation and digitalization. Likewise, given the push and if we see what's going on in the world, we cannot avoid talking about sustainable development and inclusive growth. So that was our third driver: strong, balanced, secure, sustainable and inclusive growth. We needed it, and this is not just within the organization, but also within economies, the need for us to be inclusive within our economies, as well as so it's inter as well as intra. Next slide, please. So that set the stage, and that was what we achieved, a big part of the achievement of 2020. And we moved, that was Malaysia's year, and that's why it was a Putujaya Vision. And then we moved very seamlessly into 2021, where we focused on the next step. So, okay, very well and good, you've got a vision. And I always say, if you have a vision without action to implement that vision, you're just dreaming. All of us can have visions, but do nothing about it. So this, and like ASEAN too, we had a vision for ASEAN, but we had the implementation plan. Likewise, with APEC, now that we had the vision in place, we focused last year, we worked very, very hard to get the Aotearoa Plan of Action to implement the vision. And this action plan builds on the Bogor goals as well as the Osaka action agenda. It sets out individual as well as collective action plans, and again, following those three drivers, guided by those three drivers: trade and investment, innovation and digitalization, strong, balanced, secure, sustainable, and inclusive growth. This is like our mantra. We will keep repeating it and repeating it over the years, and it must be, and we want to see it in our consciousness as we implement all our projects and programs across the different fora that we have in APEC. That will be, as it were, a guiding light for us when we are looking at what the work that we do in APEC. Next slide, please. So what is in this plan of action? So for each of the pillars that we talk about in the vision, there are aspects of work that has to be done. So for trade and investment, for example, trade facilitation will continue to be very important for us. So strengthening, reducing barriers to business, making sure that our systems are more open and predictable, supporting APEC as an incubator of ideas. This is where a lot of the work that we've done has contributed to the WTO work. If you look at the trade facilitation agreement in the WTO, it started at APEC. And we support the WTO in all our work that we do. Likewise, when the environmental goods agreement at the WTO also found its start at APEC. APEC pushed for it, and so we're happy to see how it's expanding and gaining traction. And as hopefully the 12th ministerial will come in June, and our ministers, the ministers responsible for trade, will meet in May. So we will firm up our position to support the 12th ministerial, the WTO ministerial. And the one other point which is as important is, how do we further advance the Bogor goals and economic integration in the region? And here's where FTAP, I know we will hear from Imamura-san in a bit about how the private sector is very, very strongly pushing for FTAP. They started this push for us in 2005, and they kept repeating it at APEC 1 when they had a meeting here in Singapore in February. They were very strong to reiterate their position on FTAP. And let me say that the senior officials have listened to them, and we are having a special meeting on FTAP on the 15th of March. And then we also agreed to have a dialogue between APEC ministers responsible for trade and APEC on FTAT in May when the ministers meet, and we're actually having an working towards some kind of statement from both APEC and the ministers. So this is a very important area of the work that we're doing. We want to continue the work on FTAT, because that's where, while we are non-binding, APEC is non-binding, but this is important for regional economic integration. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, in our work going forward, innovation and digitalization is gaining much more importance. And we've done quite a bit of work in this area already. So what we need to do now, and the lessons that we've learned from dealing with COVID-19, we all have experienced how, it was because of our quick response and using digitalization that we managed to get, to achieve so much. We did the whole year last year virtual. Malaysia's year, we had our meetings at the beginning of the year, it was in person. Then we quickly pivoted to a virtual format. Last year was virtual, and we managed to do it because we used technology well, we used the platforms well. And also the sharing of information during this period was important for us. Structural reforms, now increasingly, it's not just about rules and regulations to facilitate the flow of goods and services, but also in the area of digital trade. So, digital technology regulation, or tech reg, as they say, we need to look at that more and more. Of course, the whole idea of digital gaps, there's a lot of conversations around digital gaps and how do we share information with each other so that we have some level of consistency in our regulations. This is a big challenge for us, not just about digital infrastructure across the region, but also how do we make sure that when we use technology to assist our groups, we manage to bridge gaps. How do we help economies transition into this new? How do we help our MSMEs? How do we facilitate women's economic empowerment through digital infrastructure? So these are questions that we have on our plate, and we are working through them. Next is this is really an important area for us going forward. The sustainable development and inclusive growth agenda is so important. We just celebrated International Women's Day, where we highlighted, I highlighted what we are doing in terms, what APEC is doing in terms of women's economic empowerment. How and it's interesting that, we don't just talk about it. For women's economic empowerment, for example, we have a dashboard where we measure different aspects, 5 key aspects of women's participation in economies. And we share that with the ministers every 2 years to see how we are progressing, what kind of progress we've made. We've done very well in some areas. We have a lot to do in other areas, especially in leadership and representation. But, that will happen over time. But the important thing is that we need to make sure that there is this aspect of increased economic inclusion. Next, please. Next. Yeah, thanks. So going back to what was achieved in 2021, the Leaders' Declaration is so important because that piece of document helps us as we move forward, as we plan and ensure that there's continuity in what we've done over the past year and taking it into the next year. So the work on, because of, there were aspects of work that we did last year on responding to COVID-19, vaccine equitability, expansion of vaccine manufacture and supply, making sure all of us have access to vaccines, facilitating trade. As I talked to you, I talked about how the customs authorities quickly came together to ensure that we could facilitate the flow of the movement of these goods. Transparency at the border was important. The number of things, the TRIPS waiver at the WTO, these are some of the things that we've taken up at APEC. Next, please. So besides responding to that, to COVID-19, we also focused on the road to recovery. What is it that we will need to do more of to ensure that we can sustain recovery? One important aspect for us is the APEC services competitiveness roadmap. Again, this one, besides trade in goods, trade in services is equally important, especially in the digital sphere. And that has, we have the APEC Internet and Digital Economy Roadmap. We need to track it and implement it and ensure that we all benefit from the work that we're doing in our digital transition and transformation. Economic integration is one important area that we will keep pushing for it, but we want to make sure it is market driven, so that's the other important area for us to work on. And interestingly, there was a discussion on corruption, fraud, waste, and abuse. Transparency is what would allow us to deal with issues of this. And we have the anti-corruption technical working group. So, so that also really provides a more holistic approach to how we deal with recovery. Next. Coming now to Thailand, what we try and do is have continuity. Yes, each economy that hosts APEC has its priorities and themes, but at the end of the day, if you look at it, you will see that there is continuity and a certain consistency across the work, guided in our case now by the vision that we set out for ourselves. So for Thailand, their theme is open, connect, and balance. Open, again, relates to trade and investment. Connect is about us, we have a connectivity blueprint. It's about this year especially, how do we facilitate seamless resumption, safe and seamless resumption of cross-border travel? So Thailand, let me just say, for open, we will be, one of the key deliverables will be the work that we're doing on AFTA. On Connect is the work that we're doing on safe passage. So there's work going on how do we ensure that, the regulations that we can facilitate seamless movement of people, not just business people, but also tourists and others, essential workers, for example. And balance, this is where we're talking about inclusive economies and sustainable economic growth. Next. So one other key deliverable for Thailand is the focus on the bio-circular and green economy. So it's the production, focusing on renewables, focusing on recycling and reusing, reducing waste in different areas, as well as the green economy. So you will hear us having more conversations around this, around food, especially in our food and agriculture working groups. We've been having this discussion in our health working groups, the energy working group, as well as tourism. So there will be lots of discussion to ensure that APEC economies, push for sustainability in a big way. I want to give you some examples of projects, next slide, that we're working on to fit into this. So you will see some work that's being done on food security, on forest management, on marine debris, because that is important for sustainability of our marine life. There's some work for sustainable careers, for example, for SMEs, waste management. So these are some of the projects that fit into, I've just taken a few, which fit into what we are trying to do this year. I've come to the end of my presentation, but I see that there are questions. I'm happy to take them as we go along. Thank you.